It is the morning of September 17th, 1952, and inside a nondescript safe house on the outskirts of Frankfurt, West Germany, a Soviet general is sitting down for breakfast. He does not know that the man across the table from him works for the Central Intelligence Agency. He does not know that the coffee being poured into his cup contains a substance so new, so poorly understood, that even the scientists who synthesized it cannot fully predict what it will do to the human mind. He doesn't know that within 40 minutes the walls of the room will begin to breathe, that the face of his host will dissolve into something unrecognizable, and that in a state of total psychological collapse, he will begin to speak. He will speak for 4 hours, and what he says will send shockwaves through the highest levels of American intelligence. This is not a story from a thriller novel. It is, depending on which declassified documents you choose to believe, one of the most consequential and disturbing episodes in the history of Cold War espionage. It sits at the intersection of cutting-edge pharmacology, institutional paranoia, and a fundamental question about what governments are permitted to do to human beings in the name of national security. The general's name has never been formally confirmed in any publicly released document. The exact location of the safe house remains disputed. But the program that produced this moment, and dozens of others like it, is a matter of historical record. It was called MKULTRA, and it very nearly broke the boundary between science and atrocity entirely. To understand why the CIA became obsessed with the idea of a chemical that could dissolve a man's will, you have to understand what the late 1940s felt like inside American intelligence. The Second World War had ended with a kind of triumphalism that lasted perhaps 18 months before it curdled into something closer to dread. The Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear device in August 1949. 4 years ahead of American projections, China had fallen to the communists that same October. Then came Korea, and with Korea came something that genuinely terrified the American security establishment: the apparent spectacle of captured United States soldiers making pro-communist statements on camera. Men who had been, by all accounts, loyal and stable were appearing in propaganda films and confessing to crimes they almost certainly had not committed. The phrase that began circulating in intelligence circles was brainwashing. The Soviets, it was believed, had found a way to chemically or psychologically reprogram the human mind. The CIA's director, Alan Dulles, was convinced of it. And if the Soviets had such a weapon, then America needed one too, or better still, a defense against theirs, which amounted to the same research program. What made this moment particularly urgent was the growing suspicion that the Soviets were ahead. Reports filtered through from defectors and agents suggesting that Soviet scientists had been experimenting with mescaline, scopolamine, and various barbiturate compounds since at least the mid-1930s. The NKVD, predecessor to the KGB, had used pharmacological interrogation as a routine tool. More disturbingly, there were credible accounts suggesting the Soviets had obtained significant quantities of a compound called lysergic acid diethylamide, known at the time primarily to a small circle of European chemists and psychiatrists. LSD-25 had been synthesized in 1938 by a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann at the Sandoz laboratories in Basel, though its psychoactive properties were not discovered until Hofmann accidentally absorbed a trace quantity through his fingertips in April 1943 and experienced what he described as an extraordinary, intoxicating restlessness, accompanied by vivid, colorful imagery. The drug was being explored in legitimate psychiatric research as a potential tool for accessing repressed memory, treating alcoholism, and understanding the biochemistry of psychosis. But the CIA did not see a psychiatric tool. They saw a weapon, or more precisely, a key. The formal structure that would pursue this idea was authorized in April 1953 under the direction of a man named Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a doctorate from the California Institute of Technology, who walked with a clubfoot and kept a small farm in rural Virginia, where he raised goats and practiced folk dancing. Gottlieb was, by most accounts, a genuinely brilliant scientist, with a genuine belief that he was protecting his country. He was also capable of authorizing things that, viewed from any distance, are difficult to describe in neutral language. MKULTRA, as the program was codenamed, would eventually encompass 150 separate research projects, involve at least 80 institutions including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies, and consume somewhere in the region of $10 million in today's equivalent funding, much of it channeled through front organizations specifically to conceal its origins. Its central ambition was the development of a reliable means of extracting information from an unwilling subject, or alternatively, of rendering an enemy agent psychologically inoperative. LSD was considered the most promising candidate for both purposes. What made LSD so extraordinary and so terrifying in its potential applications was the extraordinary disproportion between dosage and effect. A quantity of the compound weighing no more than a few millionths of a gram, essentially invisible to the naked eye, was sufficient to produce profound alterations in perception, thought, and emotional state, lasting anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. Chemists would later compare this potency to imagining a single grain of salt dissolved into an Olympic swimming pool and still tasting the salt on your tongue. In practical terms, it meant the compound could be dissolved into water or any liquid without detection, administered without the subject's knowledge, and would begin to take effect within 30 to 60 minutes. The physiological mechanism involved the drug binding to serotonin receptors throughout the central nervous system, producing what researchers described as a dramatic loosening of the ordinary boundaries of the self. Time perception collapsed. The distinction between internal mental states and external reality became uncertain. The subject experienced extreme emotional vulnerability, often oscillating between euphoria and terror within minutes. Ordinary inhibitions, the CIA theorized, might dissolve with everything else. A man who would not ordinarily betray his country might, in this state, simply forget why loyalty mattered. The practical preparation of the compound for field use was managed through the CIA's Technical Services Division, which maintained laboratories in Washington and had established supply relationships with Sandoz laboratories directly. The Americans had, through a combination of negotiation and quiet coercion, effectively purchased the world's entire supply of LSD in the early 1950s, an estimated 10 kilograms, which represented 100 million individual doses at the standard psychiatric research quantity of 100 micrograms. This was not a small research project. This was preparation for a campaign. The compound could be produced as a tasteless, odorless, colorless liquid, as a fine crystalline powder, or impregnated into sugar cubes. In field applications, the liquid form was standard, added to drinks in quantities so small that no alteration in taste or appearance was detectable. The operations that followed fall into two broad categories. The first were the voluntary experiments conducted on CIA officers, military personnel, and agency-connected civilians who were asked, or in some cases ordered, to take LSD as part of controlled trials. The second category is considerably darker. These were operations in which the compound was administered to subjects who had no knowledge that they were receiving any substance at all. The Frankfurt Safe House operation falls into this second category. According to documents reviewed by the 1977 Church Committee, the Senate investigation that eventually exposed much of MKULTRA, the Soviet general who was the target of the operation, had been identified as a potential source of strategic intelligence regarding the positioning of Soviet nuclear installations in Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union. He had been cultivated by a CIA asset over a period of approximately 6 months, their relationship established under a commercial pretext. The breakfast meeting in September 1952 was the culmination of that cultivation. The quantity of LSD introduced into his coffee was estimated at between 200 and 250 micrograms, roughly double the standard psychiatric research dose, selected to ensure complete effect, even accounting for individual metabolic variation. The account that exists in the partially declassified record is fragmentary, and the words attributed to the general have never been verified independently. What the documents do describe is a subject who, within 45 minutes, became visibly disoriented, who ceased to respond to conversational norms, who became emotionally distressed, and then, according to the case officer's report, paradoxically compliant in a way that normal interrogation never achieved. Over the following 4 hours, with the case officer guiding the conversation through what the documents describe as directed non-confrontational questioning, the general provided information regarding the location, approximate size, and operational status of what the CIA assessed as 11 separate nuclear storage and delivery facilities across Soviet-controlled territory. He apparently described personnel, command structures, and in 2 cases, specific coordinates he had memorized as part of his command responsibilities. Whether all or any of this intelligence was accurate, whether it was actionable, and what operational use the CIA made of it, remains classified. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. What is known is that the operation was considered sufficiently successful that it became a template. Similar operations were conducted throughout the 1950s, though the existing record is deeply incomplete. Frank Olson, a senior scientist at the Army's Special Operations Division who was involved in aspects of the MKULTRA program, was administered LSD without his knowledge at a retreat in Maryland in November 1953. He became acutely psychotic, was brought to New York for psychiatric assessment, and on November 28, 1953, fell from the window of his room on the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel. The official ruling was suicide. His family has contested this for decades, and a 1994 exhumation and forensic examination conducted by a University of Maryland professor found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull inconsistent with a fall. The case has never been definitively resolved. The German and Soviet programs that paralleled American efforts operated along broadly similar lines, but with meaningful differences. German pharmaceutical research during the Second World War had explored mescaline as an interrogation adjunct, most notoriously at Dachau, where prisoners were administered the compound as part of experiments that the Nuremberg medical trial explicitly described as criminal. American scientists were aware of these experiments. Some of the data generated was incorporated into early MKUltra research, a fact that the Church Committee found particularly troubling. Soviet research had, by the early 1950s, moved toward a somewhat different pharmacological approach, favoring barbiturate-based compounds, particularly sodium pentothal and its analogues, which produced a state of reduced inhibition without the unpredictable perceptual disruption associated with LSD. The Soviet approach was arguably more reliable in controlled conditions, producing what interrogators described as a loosening of verbal restraint that was manageable and directional. The American preference for LSD reflected a different theoretical model, one that sought not merely to reduce resistance, but to temporarily dissolve the psychological architecture of the self entirely. This was ambitious in a way that bordered on the delusional, because the fundamental problem with LSD as an interrogation tool was the same property that made it so spectacular as a psychoactive compound. Its effects were radically unpredictable. Some subjects became euphoric and talkative. Others became paranoid and non-communicative. Some experienced what clinicians would later describe as ego dissolution, a total collapse of the sense of individual identity, which produced not cooperation, but incoherence. A subject in that state was not providing actionable intelligence. He was describing the patterns in the ceiling. The British program, conducted under the auspices of the Porton Down Research Establishment in Wiltshire, pursued parallel investigations into LSD and other compounds during the same period, though with a considerably narrower operational scope. British military researchers administered LSD to volunteer servicemen from 1953 onwards, producing footage that is both scientifically remarkable and deeply uncomfortable to watch, showing Royal Marines attempting and catastrophically failing to perform basic tasks while under the compound's influence. The British assessment, reached somewhat earlier than the American one, was that LSD was of limited tactical utility precisely because of its unpredictability. A compound that might render one subject eloquent and cooperative and another completely non-functional was not a reliable weapon. The British redirected their research toward BZ, a different class of incapacitating agent with more consistent if broader effects. The Americans continued with LSD for another decade. The legacy of MKULTRA is complicated in ways that simple historical condemnation does not fully capture. The program produced genuine scientific data regarding the pharmacology of LSD that informed legitimate psychiatric research for decades. It also produced a generation of scientists, some of whom, like Timothy Leary and others adjacent to the program, eventually carried LSD outside the laboratory and into the counterculture of the 1960s, a process whose consequences were certainly not anticipated by Sidney Gottlieb when he was authorizing covert operations in Frankfurt safe houses. More directly, the non-consensual administration of LSD to American and foreign nationals. The deaths, the psychological damage, and the systematic destruction of records ordered by CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973, as the program began to attract scrutiny. These things constitute one of the clearest documented cases of an intelligence agency operating entirely beyond any ethical or legal boundary. The 1977 Church Committee hearings produced testimony from Gottlieb himself, by then retired and living quietly on his Virginia farm. He defended the program's intentions while acknowledging that methods had, in his phrase, not always reflected the values the agency was meant to protect. He died in 1999. The surviving records, approximately 20,000 documents that escaped the 1973 destruction because they had been misfiled in a financial archive, are held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and are partially available to researchers. They are fragmentary, heavily redacted, and in places deeply strange. Reading them, you encounter the language of scientific inquiry applied to acts that would, in any other context, be straightforwardly described as assault. Return then to the Frankfurt safe house. Return to the morning light, the coffee cooling in its cup, the Soviet general who does not yet know what is happening to him. Whatever he said in those 4 hours, whatever intelligence he provided, whatever he experienced when the drug took hold of him and turned the ordinary world into something unrecognizable, he walked out of that meeting believing he had simply had breakfast. He returned to his duties, to his command responsibilities, to his life behind the Iron Curtain, carrying no memory that he had been tampered with, no knowledge that his mind had been treated as a system to be bypassed rather than a person to be persuaded. That is, perhaps, the most disturbing element of the entire enterprise. Not the drug itself, remarkable as it was. Not the ambition of the program, extraordinary as that was, but the fundamental premise that a human being's will, their loyalty, their sense of self, could be chemically dissolved and raided like a filing cabinet, and the individual left afterwards to carry on as if nothing had happened. The Soviets had their equivalent programs. The British had theirs. Every major intelligence service of the Cold War era was asking the same question. Is there a chemical that unlocks a man? The answer that history returned is more complex than either the optimists or the pessimists anticipated. There is no reliable key. The human mind, even under the most extreme pharmacological pressure the 1950s could devise, proved stubbornly resistant to being simply opened. It could be distressed, disordered, overwhelmed, broken. It could not be reliably decoded. What the Frankfurt operation and the 100 others like it ultimately demonstrated was not the power of chemistry over human will. It was the willingness of institutions, when sufficiently frightened, to treat human beings as problems to be solved rather than people to be respected. The files are partially open. The laboratories are long closed. Sidney Gottlieb's goats have presumably all died of old age. And somewhere in the National Archives, behind a redaction stamp so thick it looks almost architectural, the full account of what a Soviet general said over breakfast in September 1952 continues to wait.